So moving forward here, we want to start to talk about what are these responsibilities that we owe to our clients, and then what responsibilities do we owe to the customers. Remember, we said the difference is client is someone we do represent, customer is someone that we don't represent. And so we want to make sure we understand what these responsibilities are that we owe to our clients. What do you think are some examples of things that our clients trust us with? What do they trust us to do for them? Advice? Yeah, about what? But about what about the purchase? What kind of advice? Think about what you're actually doing. Real world. What do they want to know? How much? That's a huge question. Right. How much should I pay for it if I'm the buyer? How much should I sell it for if I'm the seller? So how much is a huge question. What else? What are the things they trust us with? Personal information. So they trust us with knowing personal information and keeping it confidential, not using it against them. They trust us with that. That's another great example of things they trust us with. How about their money? Do they trust us with their money from time to time? Do we handle checks and money and those kinds of things? Absolutely we do. So there's a lot of different types of trust that clients place in us. These duties, the book usually calls them loads, are the things that we owe to our clients. They're also known as fiduciary responsibilities because we say our client is our fiduciary. Remember that? That word fiduciary just means client. So we owe our client. And you need to pay attention to these because there are going to be test questions around this. Notice I said we owe our clients these things. We do not owe customers these things. This is not a one-size-fits-all exercise here. We owe these things to our clients and only our clients. Like loyalty, for example. We're going to talk about what loyalty is. So loyalty, one of my favorite pictures, by the way. Like, you know, there's no better representation of loyalty than somebody's dog. But loyalty is tied with obedience. Loyalty and obedience go together. That's the L and the O part of loads. Loyalty means protecting that client's personal and confidential information. Don't let it get out. Don't broadcast it to the world. And certainly do not ever use it against them. There will never be a time, ever, in your real estate career where it will be okay to use a client's personal and confidential information against them in a transaction. That's a line that never gets crossed. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. There's never a time it's okay to use personal, confidential information that you know about your client against them in the transaction. Give me an example of personal, confidential things you might know about a client that are transaction related. I'm not talking about if you know if they're stepping out on their husband. That's you don't use that either. But I'm talking about like more transaction related things. What kinds of things will we maybe know about our client related to the transaction that it would do real harm to them if the other side knew? How much they want for it, right? In other words, we know what we've got it listed for because that's public knowledge, but might we be privy to them saying, but I would take fill in the blank right here? And that would definitely be information we would not want to get out. How about the flip side? If you're working with a buyer and they're making an offer, I have been in conversations with buyers, and when you talk about what they want to offer, many times this sort of line of thinking comes up, well, let's start at this and maybe we can try to get them to this. In other words, start at this point, but they clearly make it clear they're willing to do what? To pay more, to negotiate to a higher number than what they're actually offering. Folks, this is going to be tough because there will come a time when you'll be faced with that would really help if you could disclose that. You know, that you would be really close to getting a deal done, and you just have a feeling like if I could just say that they're willing to pay this number, I feel like we could get this thing done. You can't do it. Because the only number you can disclose is the number that they've actually offered. Does that make sense for you? I mean, just to give you an example of how that might come up, if you represent a buyer and they've made an offer and you know it's a low offer, but you also know they're just taking a shot at it because the house has been on the market for 3 months, and you know they really want it. Like, I mean, you've been driving them around and they are in love with this place, but because it's been on the market for 3 months, in this market they feel like, oh, well, the seller must be desperate by now. They got it listed for $250. Let's offer them $225. Let's just see if they might take it. They might be desperate, you know. Like, yeah, we would pay the $250 because we think it's a good deal at that price, but let's just take a shot at $225. And you submit that offer, and the response you get from the listing agent is, you know, we appreciate the offer, but we really don't feel it's a very serious offer, so we're not even going to make you a counter offer. They just shut it down. Is that possible? They just shut it down because you pissed them off. But, I mean, really, that's not what it boils down. You made them mad. You insulted them with your offer. You wasted my time. I'm not going to deal with you. And so we all have this tendency to go, now listen, wait a minute, wait a minute. Just come back to me with an offer. You know, I promise my clients are really serious. Well, they certainly aren't serious with an offer of $225. Well, what if I told you they'd be willing to pay more? See, it's real tempting to do something like that. And there have been plenty of agents that have talked themselves into, well, I'm really doing the right thing for my client because I'm making the deal for them, right? Wrong. That's their personal and confidential information. You were told that in confidence, and you have to keep it that way. Is everybody clear on that? Okay? So that's what loyalty is about. Now, obedience might be even tougher than loyalty, because obedience is where you really have to know the law. We are supposed to be obedient to our clients, follow their commands, as long as those commands are legal commands. Now, obviously, there are clearly things they could tell you to do that, you know, if the client tells you to go out and shoot somebody in the street, you don't do that because it's illegal. But then there are less obvious things that your client might tell you to do that you are going to find out are illegal. For example, when we talk about offers and contracts a little bit later on in the class, we're going to talk about the fact that you never are allowed in North Carolina to disclose the contents of an offer made by one party to another interested party. In other words, if Josh has made an offer to purchase a property and Trudy has also made an offer, could it be beneficial to the seller for me to go back to Josh and say, by the way, Josh, we did get an offer in that's better than yours, so you might want to reconsider your offer? Could that be beneficial to my seller? Yeah, because what could he cause Josh to do? Raise his offer, and then when he raises his offer, you know, would it be beneficial to my seller to go back to Trudy and say, hey, Trudy, we appreciate your offer, but we did get another offer, and his is a little bit better than yours, so, you know, if you want to rethink this thing, would that be beneficial to the seller? And is the seller likely at some point to ask me to do exactly that? Or even, forget ask, tell me to do exactly that? Yes, you can't do it. Because North Carolina law is you're not allowed to disclose the terms of one offer to another offeror. And any type of giving them a relationship is the same thing as disclosing the terms. But now, can I tell Josh we have another offer? Sure. What I can't do is tell him how that offer ranks in relationship to his offer. I can simply tell him we have another offer in the hopes that he might read between the lines and raise his offer. But I cannot tell him you're behind or you're ahead, because what I'm essentially doing is disclosing the terms of somebody else's offer in order to do. Does that make sense for you guys? So that's going to be a command from your client, for example, that you can't follow. So it's loyalty always, but obedience only when what they've told you to do is within the law. So you got to be careful about the obedience part. Everybody good on that? Okay. And again, these are things that we owe to our clients. Test question they're going to get you on. Loyalty is such a nice sounding word. It sounds wonderful. It sounds like you owe everybody loyalty. You don't. You do, because loyalty, remember, is keeping somebody's personal and confidential information what? A secret. You don't owe customers loyalty. Who are customers? Everybody other than who we represent. So if I am dealing in a transaction, for example, and Yuchan is the buyer, and I'm the listing broker, and she's unrepresented, and she tells me, or she says to me, or even I just overhear, she's walking out the door and she's like, yeah, we offered kind of low. We offered $225, but we would pay the $250 if we had to. What am I going to do with that information if I represent the seller and I hear the buyer say that? I'm going to tell the seller instantly. Not only do I not owe the buyer loyalty, I actually owe them the opposite. I am going to get and use as much information out of them as I possibly can. Does that make sense for everybody? I'm going to warn her. I'm going to say, don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know. But if I've already warned her, it's up to her to stop talking, right? It's like the Miranda warning. You have the right to remain silent. Well, just because they have the right doesn't mean they have the ability. Sometimes they just keep right on going. And if they do, what are you going to do with that information? You're going to use it because you do not owe customers loyalty. Is everybody clear on that? So be careful about that one on a test. It's one they trip people up with on a test because it just sounds nice to say you owe everybody loyalty, but you don't. You only owe that to clients. Accounting. We're going to talk about that a lot more when we go through the Real Estate Commission's rules. We owe a proper accounting of monies to our clients. Again, we do not necessarily owe that to customers, but we do owe it to our clients. So examples of money that we might have to account for to our clients. If we handle things like an earnest money deposit, a deposit on a transaction, would we need to be able to account for that to our clients? Or if we're collecting rent on behalf of our clients, or tenant security deposits. If your client says, hey, I want to see your trust account balance to make sure my money's actually in there, are they entitled to see that information? Absolutely they are. It's their money. Now, they're not entitled to see your whole trust account and everybody else's money and balances and everything, but they certainly are entitled to see their balance sheet and to make sure that the money is properly accounted for, so that we owe our clients that duty of accounting as well. And then the last category, which I don't even have a slide for, is the S. It's skill, care, and diligence. Skill, care, and diligence is like a catch-all. It's you owe your client the highest level of skill possible. Here's the long and short of that. Don't take on things you are not capable of doing. Having the license to do something is different than having the ability to do the thing. Here's the thing. This is the problem with real estate licensure in North Carolina and in most states. It's different than almost every other type of licensure. Think about every other profession in the state. If you decide to go be a teacher, you go to school, you get an education degree. Can you teach everything? No, you get a certificate, an area of expertise where you've demonstrated skill, and that might be elementary language arts. Well, can you go teach high school English? No, you got to do what? Go back and get a different certificate. If you get a driver's license, can you go drive an 18-wheeler? No. You got to go back and get an endorsement on your license. Real estate doesn't work that way. It's one real estate license for everything. But that doesn't mean, because you have the license for it, doesn't mean you have the ability to do it. You're going to have to be faced with that decision a lot. There are going to be times when somebody comes to you and says, hey, you got your real estate license, right? Can you help me with this? And I'll give you an example. Let's say you had a client who you helped buy their house last year. You've only ever done residential transactions. And that client comes to you and says, you know, I'm thinking about buying a restaurant. Can you help me with that? What should your answer be? No, I cannot. But I'll be glad to put you in touch with somebody who can. Because if you've only ever worked in residential transactions, folks, you are not qualified to help them in that transaction, period. And there are so many things that go into working that transaction that you would have no idea about if you've only done, does that make sense? That you've only done residential. Now, does that mean you have to just give all the money away? No. Can you work out a referral fee? Could you even find a commercial broker and say, let's share this client. I want to tag along with you. I want to work it with you so I can learn how to work this transaction, and we'll share in the money. Of course you could. Here's what you don't do. Just take it on and do it yourself. Figure it out. Your clients are not guinea pigs. And you will get yourself sued so quickly in this business by doing that, because you don't have the expertise for it. So you've got to make sure you always have the expertise before you agree to take on anything. That's just, I honestly wish we had differentiated licenses where you had to go take a class for property management before you do it, but we don't. So you got to make sure you have the knowledge before you agree to do that. And I'll tell you bluntly, here's what you're going to be qualified to do when you leave this class. Residential real estate, and only sales. Residential real estate sales. Because that's pretty much what we spend 90% of the class talking about. You're not going to have a license that allows you to do commercial real estate. You're going to have a license that allows you to do a lot of other things, but you're not going to be qualified in those fields. So if you want to do commercial, that's great. Go affiliate yourself with a commercial firm and start following those people around and seeing what they do on a daily basis, because it is drastically different than what residential brokers do. Very different. They may as well be two different industries. And here's the interesting thing. Commercial brokers recognize that and respect that division. Residential brokers don't respect anything. You take a residential broker as a former client that comes in and says, hey, I'm thinking about buying a hotel, they'd be like, oh yeah, I can help you with that. Meanwhile, they've never even stayed in a hotel, much less bought or sold one. You take a commercial broker who's going to get ready to sell their own house, forget doing it for a client, their own house. You know what they do? They hire a realtor. They hire a residential broker and they pay them a commission. Even though they got a real estate license, they hire a realtor. And you know why? Because they say, I don't know anything about residential real estate. I don't know the laws. I don't know fair housing. Don't want to know. I am not getting myself in trouble over that mess. I'd rather pay somebody. See, they respect the division. If you end up on the residential side, make sure you respect that division too. I'm not saying don't work in commercial real estate. I'm saying don't do it if you don't have the expertise. I can't tell you over the years how many times I've turned down working on a specific type of a commercial transaction because I didn't have any experience in that. I've got plenty of experience in commercial real estate, but every commercial transaction is different. I had somebody who called me one time and they wanted me to represent them on a hazardous waste disposal facility. And I said, no. Oh, I thought you had a real estate license. Yeah. But I know nothing about hazardous waste disposal facilities, and that does not sound like something you need to be flying by the seat of your pants dealing with. Does that make sense to you guys? That sounds like a really super specialized area of real estate to me, and I don't know a thing in the world about it. Now, am I happy to find somebody for them and help refer them to somebody who can? And I did. The person was all the way in Georgia. I had to go 3 states over to find somebody who specialized in that sort of thing. But you know what? I got a phone call back from that person a year later and said, I got to thank you so much for putting me in touch with Tom. This guy knows everything about this. And the property we were looking at would not have worked for what we wanted to do with it. Now, what if I had tried to take on that transaction? Would I have known that the property they were looking at wouldn't have worked? Probably not. Somebody would have sued me because they had bought property and spent, and by the way, the property was over $3 million they were looking at. They just spent over $3 million on the property and found out they couldn't use it for what they wanted to use it for. Mad is not even begin to describe. And so that's what skill, care, and diligence is all about. You know, making sure you have the skill necessary. All right, we need to talk about the difference between an express agreement and an implied agreement. This is a little bit of contract law already, but it comes up in agency because we have these agency agreements. And agency agreements really are just contracts. These are contracts between the client and the firm. This is the contract that the client uses to hire the firm to represent them when we talk about agency agreements. And any contract can either be an express agreement or an implied agreement. An express agreement or an implied agreement. Express just means clearly laid out. Clearly laid out. In other words, the terms are clearly stated. Now, what's the best way that you can clearly state terms? With a written agreement, right? A written. We could also have an oral express agreement. There's such thing as an oral express agreement. If you have a quote-unquote handshake deal with somebody and you express the terms of the agreement, that is still an express agreement. Now, that does not work in some settings. Like, for example, in a real estate sales setting, you cannot have an oral express agreement if you want it to be enforceable in a court of law. Remember we talked about the statute of frauds? Remember that? We said the statute of frauds requires that some agreements must be in writing if we want them to be enforceable in a court of law. And we said real estate sales contracts fall under that. Is everybody okay with that? But there are certain times when we allow these oral express agreements. So express doesn't necessarily mean written, though written is a type of express. Express just means clearly stated. The goals, the promises are clearly laid out. Here's an example. Oral buyer agency. When we represent buyers in this state, eventually we're going to put that buyer agency agreement into writing, because eventually we have to, and we'll talk about the time when that has to happen, no later than a certain time. By the time they make an offer, we have to put that agreement into writing if we're going to represent that buyer. But for a time, we are allowed to represent a buyer with an oral agreement. Well, that's an example of an express oral agreement. Because just because you represent them with an oral agreement doesn't mean you're not supposed to talk to them about the agreement. You're still supposed to discuss with them the fact that you are representing them, that your firm is representing them, and here's how much you're going to be paid, and here's how you're going to be paid. Do you see what I mean? We're still expressing the terms of the agreement, even though we haven't yet put it into what? Into writing. Whereas an implied agreement, the terms never get expressed. It's just expected that you will follow through based on your actions. You do not ever want to have implied agreements for agency in a real estate transaction. That means you have broken several laws to get to that point. There are reasons we say that we want express agency agreements. You don't ever want to represent somebody without clearly them understanding that you're representing them and them deciding that they want you to represent them. Does that make sense? Implied agency would be you acting as if you had the authority even though you really didn't have it. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say I have a client who has a house for sale and it doesn't sell. They decide to rent it out. So they take it off the market. That happens sometimes. Not in this market too much, but in a more normal market, sometimes that happens. Something doesn't sell, they take it off the market, they rent it out. Well, they rent it out, they contact me, we'll pull it off the market, I'm going to go pick up my sign, all that good stuff. Meanwhile, the tenant is moving into the property. The tenant moves in on day one, they realize they don't have hot water. Now, what do I have to do with this lease? Nothing. Not a thing in the world. I had the property listed for sale, it didn't sell, I'm going to pick my mess up, get my sign out of the yard. Is everybody with me on this? The tenant moves in and they don't have hot water. Now, if you've never dealt with a tenant before, especially a residential tenant, what you realize is that when something doesn't work, they want it fixed 15 minutes ago. And they will call every phone number on the face of the planet that they can get their hands on until they talk to somebody that tells them they'll get it fixed 15 minutes ago. So they try to call the owner and nobody answers and they get voicemail. They send the owner an email, they send the owner a text message, and 37 seconds later they haven't gotten a response, so they're mad now. This is residential tenants for you. Whose sign is still in the front yard because I haven't made it over there to pick it up yet? Mine. Guess who they're going to call next? Me. What do I have to do with this lease? Absolutely nothing. And that's exactly what I should tell them the moment I pick up the phone. They'll be like, when they say, hey, this is Tommy and I just moved in over at 123 Main Street, I'm like, Tommy, it's nice to talk to you, but I have nothing to do with your lease. If you need anything, you need to call the property owner. I would be glad to give you their number. You follow me on that? Here's what you don't do. You say, Tommy, what can I help you with? Well, I just moved in over here and I don't have any hot water and I've been trying to get in touch with Sammy who owns the house and I can't get in touch with him. He hadn't called me back in like 3 days. Meanwhile, it's been 37 seconds since he sent the text message, right? And he hadn't called me back and somebody needs to get over here and fix this water. And here's what you don't ever do. You don't ever say, Tommy, don't worry about it. I'll see if I can get in touch with Sammy for you. I'll take care of it. Because what you just did is implied that you have some relationship there, that you have some responsibility for that. Does that make sense for you? Your actions imply that you are actually what? The property manager. Guess what you just became? The property manager. And guess how much you're getting paid for it? Zero. That's an implied agency relationship, and that is a really bad idea for obvious reasons. Number one, you don't want to be working for free. Number two, you just took on all of that legal responsibility. Is everybody with me on that? So you be very clear about where you don't ever even give a hint of a misrepresentation about somebody you represent. Be very clear about who you do and who you don't represent. So I'll give you an example, and this will show up as a test question right here. I'm almost going to verbatim give you a test question. I know they're going to ask it. When do you think is the appropriate time for you to make it clear to a seller or a seller's agent that you represent a buyer who's interested in that property? The first thing out of my mouth is what Christine said, and that's the perfect answer. Literally, as soon as Teresa picks up the phone, "Hey Teresa, how you doing? This is Travis. Listen, I have a buyer who's interested in your listing over on Main Street." Because she needs to know right then where I stand. Does that make sense? Because she needs to know that the person she's talking to is actually working against her in that transaction. That's fair, isn't it? And so make it clear always who you represent. Everybody good on that? Good. Good. Are we okay on the difference between express and implied? How do we terminate agency? Well, we create agency with a contract, hopefully with a written contract. We terminate it in a bunch of different ways. How do we end an agency relationship? Here's what you don't do. You don't fire a client. And they don't fire you. Because you're not their employee. And vice versa, they're not your employee. This is a contract. This is a mutual agreement. How do you end a mutual agreement? When both parties, mutually, that's exactly right, when both parties want to end the agreement. Now, there are other ways to end it. Completion. If I have a listing agreement, when is the agency relationship you think going to end with that party? When I accomplish the thing for which I was hired. So when I do what? When I close, when we sell the house. Same thing with a buyer agency agreement. Expiration. One of the things we're going to talk about is that agency agreements always have to have an expiration. So the expiration of an agency agreement would end it. We talked about mutual agreement, breach. The rest of these deal with basically a court action, except this last one. I want you to star this last one. That's one they love to ask you about on a test. It says the death, now I have changed the slide. It used to say death of either party. I've tried to make it more clear. Who is this agreement between, this agency contract? What are the two parties? The client and the what? Firm. Does death of Bo, the listing agent, have anything to do with death of the listing firm? No. So on a test, be very careful of that. Does death of Yuchan, the seller, have something to do with the listing agreement? Yes. Yes, it absolutely does. So if the client themselves dies, what happens to the listing agreement or the agency agreement? It's terminated. It goes away. If the individual broker dies, what happens to the agency agreement? Nothing, because the individual wasn't part of the agreement in the first place. The agreement was with the firm. And as long as the firm continues to operate, then that agreement continues to go on. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, one thing I'm going to point out a differentiation. I know we haven't gotten to contract law yet, but I want to explain something to you. This is only true before we put the property under contract. Death of a seller, for example, does not end a purchase contract. Death of a seller might end a listing agreement, but death of a seller... So, if I have Catherine's property for sale, and she's got it listed with my firm, and she dies, what happens to the listing agreement? It's terminated. But if I have Catherine's property listed for sale, and we've gotten an offer which Catherine has accepted, and we've gone pending, and Catherine were to die, what happens to the sales contract? It continues. You see the difference between the two? So agency agreements do not survive death, But sales contracts absolutely do survive death. So make sure you've got that differentiation in your head. Okay? Sales contracts survive death. When we talk about agency relationships and the different ones that exist, we mostly stick to sales transactions. Remember, there is agency in leases as well. Leases are still transactions. You know, don't forget them. They get sad. You forget leases. Leases are transactions too. But we mostly stick to sales transactions because generally most of the confusion happens in sales transactions. I'm going to pass out some little cards to you. Pass that back, please, Teresa. I'm going to pass out some little cards to you, and at your leisure, you don't have to do it right now, but at your leisure, I want you to separate these into 4 individual cards. They simply say on there, exclusive buyer agency, exclusive seller agency, dual agency, and designated dual agency. And we're going to talk about what each one of these is. We're not using them right this second, but at your leisure, I want you to separate these into 4 different cards, because these are the different types of agency relationships that you could have in a sales transaction. And what we're going to start to do is use these cards, so as we talk about scenarios, you can kind of point to, and by process of elimination, you have these, right? You want them? You good? You can sort of process of elimination say, oh, it's not this because you said that. So again, it's just sort of a visual aid that we're going to use as we talk about these different types of relationships. Now, when we talk about the relationship from the firm perspective, when we talk about the relationship from the firm's perspective, there's 4 possibilities. As a matter of fact, agency always comes in multiples of 4. There's always 4 possibilities. And there's 2 different ways to look at agency. You can look at agency either from the firm's perspective, or you can look at agency from the consumer's perspective. I don't want to say clients because they might be a customer as well. But from the consumer's perspective, there's 4 possibilities. And from the firm's perspective, there are 4 possibilities. Is everybody good on that so far? We're going to talk about what they are. But there's always 4 possibilities. These are the 4 ways that you see on this slide right here that a real estate firm can participate in a transaction. The word exclusive is a really important word. Exclusive. An exclusive relationship is a relationship with how many parties do you think? 1. One other party. So 2 parties, but I'm exclusive to the other party. Like if I'm dating exclusively, I'm only dating 1 other person, right? So, what do you think exclusive seller agency means from a firm's perspective? How many people in that transaction does the firm represent? Just 1. And who is that 1? The seller. So they have a direct relationship with the seller. And this is what exclusive agency looks like in sort of a visual representation. As a visual representation, this is exclusive agency. Whether it's exclusive buyer agency or exclusive seller agency, this is what it looks like. Because in this case, a transaction is always like a tug of war, right, between the buyer and the seller. Let's say this is exclusive seller agency. Here's your seller. Here's your listing firm. What is the listing firm doing? Helping. And where is the buyer? On the other side by themselves. That is what an exclusive seller or exclusive buyer transaction looks like. You've got a whole firm full of brokers pulling all on one side, helping only one party, while the poor other person is over there by themselves. Does this look fair? No, it's not supposed to be. Remember what I said earlier? It's not meant to be fair. Exclusive representation is meant to be very lopsided. Does that make sense for you? I think a picture like that helps, doesn't it? It like instantly conveys the message. Like you have this whole team full of people working on behalf of one side of the transaction, and then you've got the other party over there by themselves. That's what exclusive agency looks like. So when we talk about exclusive seller agency, that relationship, that tie, that bond is between the firm and who? The seller. And you've got the buyer over here being unrepresented by themselves. That's the exclusive seller agency. When we talk about exclusive seller agency, again, the firm only represents the seller, so nobody's on the buyer's team at all. Here's that phrase that we talked about earlier. We refer to the individual brokers as subagents of what? The seller. They are subagents of the firm, but the terminology we would most likely use is subagents of the seller. Because who's the agent of the seller? The listing firm, and all the brokers are affiliates of what? That listing firm. So they are subagents, because they're one level below the agent. They're subagents of the seller. Meaning, who do they all owe their fiduciary responsibilities to? The seller. What do they owe to the buyer? No, well, we're going to talk about what they do. They do owe them something. They owe them honesty. Right? They have to be honest, and they have to be fair to them. They owe them honesty and fair dealing. But they don't owe them any of those loads, right? No loyalty, no obedience, no accounting, no skill, care, and diligence. They don't owe them any of that. Is everybody good with that? Okay? Big thing here is to make sure that the buyer understands you're not on their team. That's going to be the biggest challenge with exclusive seller agency, is to clearly and definitively let that seller know, or that buyer know rather, I'm not on your team. And actually, not only am I not on your team, I'm doing what? I'm working against you. You got to warn them. You got to warn them. We're going to talk about how you give them that warning, but that's the big thing here, is to make sure they understand that. Now, we could also have the opposite. Exclusive buyer agency from the firm's perspective means the firm is still only involved with how many clients? One. And which one is that? The buyer. And now who's on the other side of the road by themselves? The seller is. The seller is unrepresented. We have another phrase that we use for an unrepresented seller. What is that phrase that we use? FSBO. For sale by owner. This is what a for sale by owner transaction would look like. It means all the brokers who are involved in the transaction are on one team, and that one team is whose team? The buyer's team. Everybody's on the buyer's team there. Nobody on the seller's side. Sellers by themselves, unrepresented. That's exclusive buyer agency. Does that make sense? So we've cleared 2 of the 4 possibilities from the firm's perspective. The most common transaction is this one. When you look at that visual image, what is the first thing that pops out at you? It's equal. It's balanced. Does that make sense? There's balance here. You've got a buyer and you've got a seller. Do they each have help?
Yes.
They do. And because they each have help, the transaction is more balanced out. Would you agree with that? This is a co-brokered transaction. Now, you don't have a card yet for that because your cards are more about the client's perspective. Remember, this is from the firm's perspective. A co-brokered transaction, we talked about this a little bit earlier, we hit on it a little bit. How many real estate firms are involved in a co-brokered transaction? 2. One that represents each side. One represents the seller's best interest, and a separate firm represents who? The buyer's best interest. Does that make sense for everybody? And it's called a co-brokered or cooperative transaction because they're cooperating with each other to get the transaction accomplished, but ultimately they're working against one another as far as working for their own client. This person on the listing side is doing everything they can to help the seller and doing nothing to help the buyer over here. Does that make sense? That's a co-brokered transaction. And this is by far the most common type of transaction you would expect to see in North Carolina. This one right here. And so this would be an example of that. You've got 2 firms, one representing the seller and a separate one representing the buyer. Notice there's no line between the firms. The firms have no relationship to each other. It's not one firm representing both, it's 2 firms. One representing the buyer and a different firm representing the seller. Is everybody good on that? Now let me give you a note about firms because this is a common point of confusion. Keller Williams is not a real estate firm. Howard Perry Walston Coldwell Banker is not a real estate firm. York Simpson Underwood Berkshire Hathaway is not a real estate firm. Century 21 is not a real estate firm. Those are brands. Does that make sense for everybody? McDonald's is not a restaurant. McDonald's is a brand. The McDonald's at the corner of Six Forks Road and Wake Forest Road is a restaurant. That location is a restaurant. Does that make sense to you guys? So Keller Williams is not a firm. Each individual Keller Williams location is a what? Is a firm. So could it be a co-brokered transaction where you have Keller Williams Premier on one side and Keller Williams North Raleigh on the other side? Yes, and those are still two separate real estate firms. They have no relationship legally to one another. Does that make sense for you guys? So don't confuse a franchise or a brand with a firm. A firm is a physical location. So if you have an office that has two physical locations, how many different firms is that? That's two different firms, okay? And that means two different brokers in charge, and they're two completely separate entities as far as the real estate commission is concerned. Is everybody okay with that? All right? So this is what a co-brokered transaction would look like, and it is by far the most common one. Now, before we go any further, there's one more we haven't talked about, but before we get into that, because that's a deep topic that we need to jump off into, dual agency is the last one. We need to talk about buyer agency, because we can't talk about dual agency without talking about buyer agency. Buyer agency is a little bit different than seller agency. So, and this is going to be an exam topic, so you just something you need to pay attention to. Seller agency, listings, and I'm going to back up and talk about another word here in just a second. Jump around a little bit. Listings, you need to get used to that terminology. When we talk about the seller's side of the transaction, from now on we're going to call that the listing side of the transaction. Because when you get a listing, who are you representing? The seller. A listing means you represent the seller. So the listing firm is the firm that represents the seller. Is everybody okay with that terminology? Listings are required to be in writing. Always. Always, 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 always. You as a real estate broker cannot ever even have a conversation with somebody about a property and say, oh, I have this listing that you would love, unless you actually have that listing agreement what? In writing from the seller. I mean, even, I'll give you a real world example. Real world example. Let's say that Bud comes to my office, sits down with me and says, listen man, I'm thinking about selling my house. Would you be willing to list it for me? And I say, yeah, I would. And we talk about how much I'd charge and how much he wants to list it for. And he says, good, let's get it done. Let's just go ahead and get the paperwork drawn up and let's get the ball rolling. Okay? That afternoon, I go to a little social event, and another broker comes up to me and says, gosh, I got this buyer, I cannot find a property for him. I've been looking all over the place. And I said, well, where are they looking? And they tell me it's Bud's neighborhood. I said, well, what price point are they looking at? And it's exactly where his price point is going to be. And they're looking for his house. Can I even tell them anything about that house? Can I say to them, listen, I'm going to have a listing coming up that you need to look at. Can I even broach the topic? No, because I do not have what yet? A written listing agreement. You don't ever engage in anything on behalf of a seller until you have that agreement in writing. That's the law in North Carolina. You don't put a sign in the ground. You don't talk about it. You don't do anything until you have a written listing agreement. Are we all good on that? That's the seller side. The buyer side is much less stringent, much more flexible. Here's what you're going to learn if you don't know it already. Buyers, bless their hearts, are flaky. Buyers are time wasters. Buyers don't know what they want. They think they know what they want. They don't know what they want. I'm not saying any of this critically, I'm just saying it as a fact. I actually prefer the buyer side. I'm one of the rare agents who do. I just find it more emotionally fulfilling to work on the buyer side. I find sellers to be a royal pain in the rear end, quite honestly, most of the time. I mean, I'm an emotional person. I feed off the emotion of the thing. Sellers have no positive emotion. You can list a seller's house, get them $50,000 more than list price, and get it cash, closing in 2 weeks, and they will look at you and be like, y'all make way too much money. And I'm like, what do you want me to do? You know, you get a buyer and you take care of them, they're going to invite you to their housewarming party, they're going to invite you to their kids' birthdays, they're going to send you cards, send you pictures of updating their house. You become part of their life, right? And some of you hear that and you think, God, that's, ugh, who would want to do that? You're going to have to decide which person you are. See, I'm the latter. I want that connection with them over the long term. Sellers are very transactional. What can you get me right now? Now. Leave me alone, right? And that's not me. Even though you make a lot more money on the listing side long term because you handle a lot more listings than you can buyers, because buyers are time wasters, right? But for me, part of the joy of the process is getting to know them and being able to really get inside their mind about what they want and what they need and getting that right fit for them and seeing their family grow into that place. That's just part of it for me. You do. You build a much longer term relationship with them, you know. And then later on they're going to want to sell, and then that's a much easier listing. The best listings you can ever have are selling the house you help somebody buy, because you already have that relationship with them, you know. And that's when I do like the listing side, because now they see me as more than just a transaction. You know, they see me as a long-term part. But I tell you all that to say, we could never operate as buyer's agents if we had the same rules for buyer agency that we had for listings. How many buyers do you think would be willing to sign a written buyer agency agreement before you could even show them a house or talk to them about property? It would never happen, right? Most buyers want you to show them 100 houses before they'll even think about a piece of paper. You know, they're like, oh, paper? I mean, like they think they can buy a house without looking at paper. You know, it doesn't work that way. Eventually you're going to have to sign some paper. But they're very gun shy, right? So the rules are written around that. Buyers can have oral buyer agency agreements. You are allowed to work with a buyer with an oral buyer agency agreement for a limited amount of time. If you want to continue through the whole transaction with that buyer, you do have to put that agreement into writing. And right here it tells you when that has to happen. Look at that last point over there. It says it must be put into writing when? Before you present an offer on their behalf. Before you present an offer on their behalf, and here's why. If I am presenting an offer on their behalf, remember when I said if I call Teresa and she has a listing, what's going to be the first thing out of my mouth? Teresa, I have a what? I have a buyer who'd like to make an offer on your listing. See, the only way that statement is true is if I have a written agreement with that buyer. Does that make sense for everybody? I can only move forward at that point and reach out to the other side if I actually have a written agreement. I can do everything else with an oral agreement. I can show them property. We can even write up the offer. I've heard people say, oh, if you're going to write an offer for them, you have to put the buyer agency agreement in writing. That's not even true. We can write up the offer. It's the presenting the offer. Because at that point, I'm reaching out to somebody else. And that somebody else is going to assume that I legally represent this buyer, and so I have to make that true. Does everybody follow with that about the why it's that point in time? So when I present that offer to the other side, that's when I have to put that buyer agency agreement into writing. So if I've done all these showings and we've written up the offer, and then I say, okay, well, we need to have this buyer agency agreement signed, and they won't sign it, what do I have to tell them about their offer? I can't present it for you. I can't present it for you. I'm going to have to shred it. What do you mean? That's what the law says. That I can't present this offer on your behalf unless I legally represent you. And so then you'll have to learn how to present your buyer agency agreement and talk to them about signing a written buyer agency agreement. Here's one of the things I'll tell you, and it's not a part of the test, but just as a sort of a tip for doing the business. Most of the time, buyers are reluctant to sign buyer agency agreements because they don't really understand what they're committing to, number one. Or because the buyer agent is asking them to commit to something way beyond what is reasonable in the first place. I can't tell you how many buyer's agents will put a buyer agency agreement in front of a buyer that says, you'll use me for the next 6 months.
Mine says a year.
Yours says a year, right?
Yeah.
How well do you know this person?
I bought my first house together.
You bought your first, so you do at least have a relationship, right? Well, imagine somebody who's a first-time home buyer and they've shown them one house and they want to submit an offer on that one house, and now this buyer's agent puts a buyer agency agreement in front of them that says it's for a year. Crap, I'd be reluctant to sign that too, wouldn't you? And people all the time, I get agents that come and say, I have the hardest time getting a buyer agency agreement signed. I say, okay, well, give me the last one you tried to get signed. And it says in there, it's for a year, and it's for the whole state of North Carolina. And I'm like, why didn't you ask for their firstborn child while you at it? What do you mean? I'm like, have you ever thought about not making the thing so scary sounding? It doesn't say what kind of buyer agency agreement you need. It just says you need a written one, right? Could we do it for a week? Sure we could. Could we do it for one property? Could we make it only valid for that one property? Because here's the thing. If they have a trust problem, because that's really what it boils down to. When they won't sign this thing, it's about a trust issue. People have trust issues. That's just part of life. I'll look at them and I say, I understand. I get it. I don't sign anything anybody puts in front of me either. Here's the truth, though. I don't want to work with you unless you want to work with me. But the law requires me to present this offer that we're writing. The law requires me to have a written buyer agency agreement. So let's do this. Let's make a written buyer agency agreement just for this one property and make it good for the next week. If you want to make an offer on another property and you don't want to use me, it only covers this property. If you want to come back 2 weeks from now and make another offer on this property, it's only good for a week. I am not trying to tie you down. I want you to see that I have your best interest at heart. If you do that, what are the odds that they're going to be willing to commit to a more long-term buyer agency agreement or a broader one? You see what I'm saying? Because once you get them to commit to that and they see that you really are working in their best interest, they're not, the trust issue falls away.
Because I haven't signed it yet, because I got a feeling,
You're looking at a year. A year's a long time. But they may suck, right? I mean, let's be honest about the thing. You get out there, I have people all the time say, my agent sucks. I'm like, well, how long did you hire him for? I don't know, a year? Well, it sucks to be you, you know? Why'd you hire him for a year? I didn't know, they just put it in front of me. Well, there's your first lesson, right? You see what I mean? And so if I was you, I'd be reluctant to sign one for a year. For that very reason. Unless I already had I don't even ask my clients that I've done 10 transactions for to sign buyer agency agreements for a year. My buyer agency agreements are usually for a month. Because I feel like in a month, one of two things is going to be true. We're either going to have already found what they're looking for, number one, or number two, they're going to be sick of me and I'm going to be sick of them, and they may want the opportunity to work with somebody else. I may want the opportunity to work with somebody. That works both ways too, you know. So, I think it's crazy to ask somebody to commit to a year on buyer agency, but that's my personal opinion. But you do see how shortening the time, making it for a specific address, could really help overcome that issue. Because if this person had given it to you and said, let's just do it for a month, and let's just do it for Raleigh, would you be more likely to have signed it?
I would have signed it already.
Instantly. You would have done it. There you go. Yes, ma'am.
So the agency that you're signing is with the firm?
With the firm.
The particular agent. So
Correct.
I mean, if you did sign, say, they didn't educate you enough on this, and you read it and you're like, oh my God, this is for a year, but I don't like this agent. Can you say, obviously I have to stay with the firm, I request a different agent?
You absolutely can. And that's going to be ultimately up to the broker in charge. The person to have that conversation with is the broker in charge of the firm. And if you ever find yourself in an agency situation where you are uncomfortable with the representative of the firm who is handling your transaction, please recognize that there's nothing set in stone that that's the person who has to work with you, because you're exactly right. Who have you actually hired? You've hired that firm.
She's the broker in charge. But
Well, there you go. She is the broker in charge, so ultimately you're dealing with one and the same, you know. And that makes it even scarier, right? Because you know in that case, you don't have any other recourse. There is no, I mean, it's all that person's decision, you know. That was one of the reasons that as a broker in charge, I never competed with my agents. I didn't believe in that because I felt like I needed to be a neutral observer. So that when and if a client, it was rare, but when and if a client came to me with a complaint about one of my brokers, one of the first things I would say to them is, you tell me what makes this right for you. You know, if a seller came to me and said, listen, I listed it with so-and-so and they're not doing anything and the pictures are terrible and, you know, I'm just really unhappy. The first thing I would say to the client is, you tell me what makes it right for you. Because we've got several options here. Number one, if you just want to be done with us, period, I'll be happy to release you from this listing because I do not want you to feel trapped in this. Number two, if you would like, I will be glad to get this over to somebody else within my firm and make sure that it gets handled in the appropriate manner. Or number three, I will be glad to personally take it over and make sure it gets handled in the appropriate manner. You tell me what is the best result for you. Because see, as a broker in charge, I have the authority to make that call. Does that make sense for you guys? And here's the thing, people would say, well, that's not fair because you're taking away from that person, you're taking their money away from them. I didn't say anything about what I was doing with the money because that's between me and the broker in my firm, right? There have been times when I have done that and have still paid that broker their full commission. But I use it as a teaching experience for them. I said, listen, you messed this up so badly that I had to come in here and fix it for you. I had to take it over and I had to babysit this the rest of the way home because you screwed it up. Next time you won't get paid on it because next time when somebody has to take one away from you, the person that they give it to is going to get paid on it. So you see what I'm saying? But that's not between the client, that's between the broker in charge and the broker. So you're exactly right. If you're dissatisfied as a consumer, then that's where you should go, is to the broker in charge and say, this is not working. Can you provide me some relief here? Does that make sense for everybody? I mean, I view that as part of the role of the broker in charge. And yes, I've had to babysit more than one because agents are real good at making a mess of things sometimes, you know. And you know, it's sometimes with clients, it's just about making them feel heard, you know, and sometimes they're completely wrong. Sometimes, I mean, I've had ones call me and say, you're an agent, and then they can relay the story to me, and I'll take a deep breath and I'll say, you know what? Quite honestly, they were a lot more patient with you than I would have been because you're ridiculous. And so what I'm going to offer to you is to let you go and let you go find somebody else to terrorize because we're not it. And you would be shocked at the silence you hear on the other because they are so like girded up for war, like you're going to try to hold them there and chart, and then they'll be like, well, no, don't do that. I'm like, oh, my, how things have changed. It's all about how dealing with people, you know. But ultimately, here's the most important thing about any agency relationship. You treat these people the way you would like to be treated. If you find it awkward that somebody would ask you to commit to a one-year buyer agency agreement when you've only known this person for a week, then they do as well. And so don't put them in that position. Don't force them to try to make that call. I always looked at it this way. I never worried about whether or not somebody's going to want to renew my buyer agency agreement because I knew I was doing a great job for them and that they were going to want to renew it. It wasn't going to be me chasing them for it. It was going to be the fact that they wouldn't want it any other way. And I'm not saying that's a perfect approach, but I'm saying it's a better approach than trying to tie somebody down with something. Okay, everybody good with this? So we can have oral buyer agency, but we have to put it into writing when? Before we present an offer on their behalf. Before we present an offer on their behalf. Now, we're going to take a break right here for lunch. And here's why. Dual agency, which is the last option from the firm perspective, is a big topic. In fact, it's probably a rest of the day sort of topic. But dual agency is super deep and super important. I don't want to break it up into chunks. So let's go ahead and take our lunch break and just be back at 1 o'clock, okay? And then we will pick up the dual agency discussion.